The battle against one's heart is what distinguishes man from all lower forms of existence. He realizes, however vaguely, that there is something beyond our finite awareness which he must grapple with and attempt to understand. Go to the desert to listen to the voice of God, and you will receive insight, understanding, and wisdom. The essence of creation, the basic elements, earth, sky, and man, unencumbered by the very starkness of the surroundings. The only sounds are those within, echoing in an environment absolute in its purity. The time, the 4th century AD, the place, the deserts of Egypt. The protagonists, the first Christian hermits, the desert fathers. In an atmosphere of obedience, celibacy, and poverty, where the sole aim is ascetical preparation for the mystical experience underlying all religions, the monastery, where all activities have one essential goal, to foster contemplation and adoration of God.
Anso
The soul awakens to a consciousness of the divine reality and turns its back on the world of unreality in an attempt to pass from the imperfect to the perfect. But what does the term monasticism really mean?
Monasticism is a word that is based mainly on a Greek word, means one. Mona in Greek means one. And it is adopted in all other languages, in English, in French, in German, in all other languages, in Coptic, of course. So this is kind of life in which a man or a woman leads his life solely so as to reach perfectness. To reach this aim or end, one has to concentrate on his soul and to go to the innermost of his soul so as to discover what he is and why he is created.
Early Christianity was in reality ascetic in the original sense of the word, which in Greek is equivalent to exercise. For the early ascetics were athletes, pitting themselves against the world, the flesh and the devil, subjecting themselves to feats of severe and strenuous self-discipline, all for religious ends.
Monasticism started from the very early days of humanity. Even in ancient Egypt, there were some people, before Christianity. But when we speak about the time of monasticism in Christianity, there are only some few people who are most famous. I should first mention St. Paul.
St. Paul the Theban, or Paul the Hermit, is traditionally regarded as the first Christian hermit. He was born around about 234 AD in Thebes, in the deep south of Egypt. He fled to the hills during the persecution of the Emperor Decius, round about 250 AD, and lived in seclusion and prayer for almost 100 years, dying in or about 341 AD. St. Paul is the example of an extreme form of monastic practice, living in complete solitude with recourse to no one, nowhere, at any time. monastic life, as understood by the monks of Egypt, is known as the angelic life, and those who acquire the highest degrees of monasticism are clothed in what is known as the angelic garment. To attain this level necessitates the mortification of all desires and the relinquishing of the world and worldly vanities. Shedding all worldly desires and developing a high sense of spirituality, the monk can then attain a deeper contemplation and adoration of God. St. Anthony was born around about 250 AD. He was of noble birth. At the age of 20, he heard the gospel being read and was deeply moved. Selling all he owned, for he was a wealthy landowner, he then adopted the ascetic life. At first he lived near human habitation, and then later, and for a period of almost 20 years, in complete solitude in the desert. It was at Deir el-Maymoun in Beni Suef, some 120 kilometers south of Cairo, that St. Anthony founded the first monastic community. The cave at Mount Qisma in the eastern desert near the Red Sea coast, where he spent many years in prayer and meditation, is now an important place of pilgrimage for Coptic Christians. St. Anthony is known as the father of monks because it is he who instituted a community of hermits visiting each, but individually, as their abbot or father. But how has life changed in today's monasteries?
Well, first of all, we have to say that it has changed to a large extent, mainly through greater intercourse between the laity and the clergy and the monks. Because for many, many centuries, contact with the outside world was through camel caravans bringing supplies from the Antonian dependency of Bouche, and these supplies would come over quite a long period of time, and there was very little other contact with the world outside. Later, of course, these supplies were brought in by trucks, and this made, first of all, contact with the outside world easier, and more, the result was more interchange of ideas, more contact between people outside the walls of the monastery and people inside the walls of the monastery.
Visitors and strangers are always well received and generously welcomed. Yet this is a double-edged sword. Whereas visitors do in fact disturb a life of quiet contemplation, yet without them there can be no interaction with the outside world and potential recruits to the monastic order.
شكرا أقس.
شكرا. سلام.
سلام. ما تنساش بكرة.
حاضر.
St. Anthony's Monastery was founded a few years after his death in the 4th century. It was built at the foot of Mount Crisma near the Red Sea coast and beneath the cave where he lived and worshipped in solitude for many years. Here we must differentiate between solitude and loneliness. Solitude is the main goal of monastic life, an awareness of being genuinely and joyfully alone and yet one with all. These are men who have withdrawn from society yet live a common life governed by a single simple tenet. God is the only authority, and that apart from his manifest will, there are few or no principles. The Desert Fathers are preoccupied with meaning rather than purpose. They are men who are seeking that almost magical instance of heightened awareness, where perception comes suddenly as in a flash, bringing a realization that the universe is an integrated whole and that man is part of it. The fathers were humble and silent men. Their replies to questions were brief and always to the point. They declined to be ruled by men and had no desire to rule over others. The society they sought was a totally egalitarian one, where the only authority under God was that of wisdom, experience, and love. St. Pachom, or Pachomius in Greek, was born in the south of Egypt around about 285 AD and died in or around 346. He realized the benefits of unifying the different Christian communities. St. Pachomius drew the individual ascetics together and formulated the rules and regulations governing their daily lives. This early monastic community was to be pious, enlightened, and self-sufficient. Rather than severe tests of the flesh and the will, the new initiate was placed simply under a period of probation. Before his death in 346 AD, he had founded 9 monasteries containing some 3,000 monks.
For St. Pachomius, while he himself led a solitary life for many years, but for those who wished to follow him, his way, he found it very difficult for these beginners or freshers to lead this very solitary life. This is why he made a kind of community. That is, these monks they pray together, they eat together, they meditate together, and this is why it became a kind of community, a monastic community. In this wise, the monastery is changed into what is called cloister, not a monastery. This is it's a slight difference, but it is important in order to distinguish these three systems of monasticism in Egypt. Now, the monastic life in Egypt now, it is no more like St. Anthony system, but it is mainly following the system of St. Pachomius. That is a cloister. They lead a social life together, they pray together, they eat together, and also they work together. And this is very important in the system of St. Pachomius, that he started to order every monk to work, and if he does not work, he must be expelled out of the cloister.
But what is it that makes men decide to become monks?
These people read about St. Anthony, St. Pachomius, and they wished to follow this kind of life. So, I mean, it's a kind of spiritual attitude. When they read about St. Anthony and St. Pachomius, and they welcome this kind of life and they liked to join it. So this is the real attitude.
Of course, there isn't one single reason, there are many reasons, and there may be more than the ones I have just thought of. One, of course, is reading the Holy Scriptures, as was the case with the founder of the monastic movement in Egypt, St. Anthony. It was through reading the Bible that he became a monk, decided to become a monk. Another reason is simply some mystical experience which may have occurred in somebody's life, perhaps a vision, perhaps a sense of inspiration, certainly a sense of the vanity of the world, and a sense of being near to God in the desert, because the desert has no other temptations, no other possible inveiglements away from one's desire to be near God. A third one, perhaps also, after all we are weak creatures, is a sense of guilt. Guilt about the way we have lived, the way we are living. There again, the desire to go to the desert, to go to a monastery, may be motivated by a sense of guilt. Another reason, of course, might be if you are already in the church, if you are already part of the hierarchy, you may wish to obtain promotion within the church. And in Eastern churches, you cannot become a bishop if you are a parish priest. You have to become a monk. And monks become bishops, and bishops can become eventually patriarchs. Then, of course, there is the question of vocation. People who become monks say that they are called to it. It is a calling. And this is, of course, one of the most deep mystical experiences of all, which one cannot really discuss because one doesn't know how it happens, but it does happen to people. I think those are some of the main reasons which motivate a person to go into the desert and to become a monk.
Saint Athanasius was born in 295 AD, probably in Alexandria. By 328 he was chosen amidst heavy opposition to become Bishop of Alexandria. His career saw a series of banishments, but he stood firm against the rationalistic tendencies of his opponents by maintaining the primacy of faith over reason. As a friend of the monks, he fostered the ascetic life, and through his famous biography of St. Anthony, he spread the spirit of monasticism to the West.
Some of those religious people who heard about the monastic life came to Egypt, and they lived in our monasteries for some time. And then when they went back to Switzerland, to France, to England, to Ireland, and to all these places, they instituted monasteries after they lived in Egypt, and after they left to their countries, they instituted monasteries. And it happened, this is the way how monasticism spread from Egypt to Switzerland, to France, to Italy, to Britain, to Ireland, and to some other countries.
Men who deserted a society whose only aim was the superiority of its members over one another. Men who sought, most of all, their own true self.